This session, we're turning to the private sector and focusing principally on the role of the private sector as an actor, as well as private sector development flows. We've had one speaker who unfortunately has had to pull out, is Peter Sullivan, who's the Managing Director and Head of the Public Sector Group for Africa at Citigroup. In the best traditions of the private sector, we've had a lot of squabbling just before we came in here over the redistribution of Peter's time and who was going to get how much of that time. But all of you will be very glad to hear that I drew a line in the sand and said there's no redistribution, the time goes to the audience. So it means we're going to have slightly longer for discussion. I think we've actually got a really good panel in terms of taking forward some of the debates that we had yesterday and building on some of the challenges that were raised by Simon. The first speaker is going to be Matt Lilly, who's a CEO for Africa at Prudential. And it's particularly appropriate, I think, that we've got Matt here because Prudential have just opened programs in 2 countries in Africa, in Ghana and Kenya. And, you know, I think this issue of how do you bring affordable and reasonable insurance to the world's poorest people in Africa and elsewhere is something that I know the Prudential is grappling with. And I think to get an understanding of the sort of the real dynamics of establishing insurance operations, developing affordable premiums and affordable products in Africa is absolutely critical. And I think this is also one of the areas that, you know, as Simon mentioned before, that the world is changing in really dramatic ways. And I think one of the most dramatic examples that I can think of is actually M-Pesa in Kenya and what that's done to the consumer banking market in Kenya. And it's, you know, an area that I think is clearly going to affect the insurance industry as well. Our second speaker is Magdalena Appentang, who's Director of the Public Investment Division in the Ministry of Finance of the government in Ghana. And Magdalena, it's great to have you here as well, because I think Ghana has really been at the cutting edge of a lot of the changes that we've been discussing yesterday and this morning. That, you know, firstly, Ghana was I think I'm right in saying the first country to return in quite a big way to the sovereign bond markets in 2007 and 3 times since then as well, you know, with all the benefits and potential risks that brings for the country. But I also know you're very directly involved in the public-private partnership part of government work in Ghana. And again, I think Ghana probably has one of the most developed public-private partnership legislative frameworks in sub-Saharan Africa. So we very much look forward to hearing from you. And then Meenakshi Nath, who's head of the private sector development section in DFID. And I know that DFID, like many other donors, are struggling with this issue of, what's the appropriate mix of capital going into grants for development and into sort of equity and other instruments to support private sector development, you know, recognizing that the private sector is where the jobs are created, and, you know, sort of understanding the right type of mix of financing instruments and of approaches. And Professor Stephanie Griffiths-Jones, who's the Financial Markets Programme Director, who will be our last speaker, Financial Markets Programme Director of the Initiative for Policy Dialogue at Columbia University, also happens to be a Senior Research Associate at ODI, I'm delighted to say. And many of you will know Stephanie's work on financial regulation. And it does strike me as important that yesterday we had an awful lot of discussion about the flows of finance. We had less discussion about the regulatory framework behind those flows. And I know there is concern in many developing countries that some of the regulatory instruments that have been developed, you know, in the context of Basel and the Financial Stability Forum, may not be the most appropriate for supporting development in some of the world's poorest countries. And I think there's also an issue that we were discussing before we came into this room about the ways in which anti-money laundering and anti-terrorist regulatory mechanisms in the north are raising the cost of financial service delivery for the poor, you know, with potentially huge implications for development that haven't necessarily been thought through. So there's a whole range of exciting issues for us to get our teeth into, and I'll pass over to Matt. 10 minutes. Off you go. Thank you.